All right, today we are very pleased to have somebody with us today for Chamber Chat. It's our City Council person, Andrew Lewis, representing District 7. We're pleased to have him on today and talking about some of the issues that are on everybody's mind. Andrew, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Also with us, a couple of our board members, Pat Kraft, who is currently president of the Chamber Board, as well as Daniela Ing. So we'll be talking about some of those issues, and let's go ahead and start about one that's on everybody's mind right now. It's all over the news. It's all over social media. Everybody's talking about the term of defunding the police. And so we just want to get an idea from you, Andrew. What does that term mean to you, and how is the city council addressing that currently?
Yeah, so Jason, thanks for starting with that question because it's a really important conversation to be having around how we're meeting our charter obligation to public safety, and making sure that we right size our first response. And really, like the term that I've been using is right sizing because I think it's more accurate than defund, which I personally think is a poor branding choice for what the advocates of defund generally are advocating for, which is just to send a more right-sized and appropriate first responder to respond to certain types of emergencies. So the council did a analysis with the Seattle Police Department of 911 calls, and this was partly at my insistence to really look at, okay, well, we need to do an analysis if we're going to do anything with the police department, to really look at what are people calling 911 for, and what are we sending the police to respond to? And that analysis was really interesting, to see that 56% of the calls police were responding to were non-criminal calls. And that's not to say that those are just like non-violent crimes or like misdemeanor crimes. It's that 56% of their calls are no crime whatsoever. They're welfare checks. They're maybe citable types of offenses, sort of like kind of civility types of offenses that aren't criminal but could still be fined. Someone could be fined for. They could be public health related calls where I had a conversation with someone in Queen Anne yesterday, who was talking about how there's a person who sleeps on the bench every day in this park that's across the street from her house, and otherwise the guy doesn't do anything that's against the law, but he's clearly kind of loitering and sleeping on this bench in a way that's not intended to be used. And she just wanted the guy to get some help, didn't know who to call or who to send. And right now, in a lot of cases, we are sending the police to calls like that, and they get to the scene, and there's not really much that they can do. I mean, they can move the guy along, or they can trespass the guy from the park, potentially. But it's a public park, so even if I don't want to dwell on this example too much, but if he's there and not doing anything, there's really not a reason he can't sleep on the bench during the normal operating hours of the park. So in any event, what that suggested to me is that we need some type of, and this is inextricably linked with our conversations around homelessness, we need some kind of low acuity first response that can supplement the mission of the police. And if that reduces police caseload, that could go with a commensurate reduction in police staffing. But that's contingent on developing, building up, and staffing some kind of first response like that. And there's a couple of options. One that we have here that's pretty promising is the fire department has a program called Health One that's only downtown, and it's in pilot stage. But it's nearing 6 months into its practicing pilot, being out in the community and delivering low acuity responses to mostly health related situations, public health related situations, and behavioral mental health actually as well. That program looks like it's ripe for scalability. Chief Scoggins and I have had lots of conversations about how we could scale that pilot to be citywide, or even just maybe start by expanding it to being in other parts of District 7. Currently, it only serves the downtown core with one van during normal business hours of operation. Clearly it needs to be a 24/7 response service, and it would be good if the service area was broader than just the downtown core. I'd like to see Health One be in a position where they can be expanding, for example, in the context of this town hall, to a lot of low acuity public health responses that occur out on Commodore Way in Magnolia, where we have a high density of calls like that. So I think that I try to rebrand whenever I talk about this and say right size instead of defund. Now, I mean, I'm going to say this, the defund world is not monolithic. And there's certainly a lot of people that are really talking about, abolishing the entire police department that are in the coalition and doing organizing. And, they're certainly, entitled to their opinion to be able to organize and advocate for a policeless world. But, that is not what I or most of my colleagues on the council are really talking about, except for Councilmember Sawant. So, in terms of the initial balancing round of reductions that the council made in the summer balancing session, which was mostly to close our budget deficit of $300 million, the only cuts that we made were for the most part, the balancing cuts that the mayor and the chief had requested, which was $20,500,000 in reductions to the police department. Councilmember Sawant had proposed an $80 million cut, which the rest of the council rejected. I don't even think she got a second vote for any of those proposals. The proposal the council put forward was slightly higher than the mayor and the chief, so it was $23 million. We did proviso 100 police staffing positions, though it's important to note that those are provisos and not cuts. And that they were provisoed to set up bargaining. So some of those provisos could be reversed in the event that in bargaining with the Seattle Police Officers Guild, as part of the give and take of that, some of the provisos be reversed and some of the savings be realized through some other things like overtime reform is one of the big things we're talking about. I mean, we saw a great piece by Dan Beekman of several hundred officers who through overtime were able to make well over $200,000 a year, which fair enough. If the overtime rules are there, I don't begrudge anyone for taking advantage of them. But I think that there's a consensus forming among city leaders that there might be some scope to maybe reform overtime and have that inform how we do staffing, since it sure seems that we're putting a lot of money into overtime right now, and there might be other ways that we could spend that. Certainly looking at equipment and how we can save money through the demilitarization of certain police functions. I had a great conversation yesterday with somebody who was talking about the installation of kit into the mass ordered Ford SUVs that we use for the Seattle Police Force, and that Seattle is currently using one of the more expensive kits to outfit the vehicles, which go in excess of what the baseline requirement is that we put into them. So there's ways to also be saving in fleet and also make vehicles and uniforms and equipment more in line with the community-driven ethos of the department. There were some things where I had very strong disagreements with my colleagues and I wasn't able to get my way in the summer budget session. I felt extremely strongly that we should not be cutting the pay of the police chief and the high-level command staff of the police department. There was an amendment put forward by Councilmember Sawant that passed on a 6-3 vote. In the minority there, I was joined by council members Peterson and Juarez against cutting the chief's pay. I came back on the Monday after that vote with an amendment to reverse the entire thing. That amendment didn't even get a a second person to support it, and that cut went into effect. And then we saw the next day that the chief left the department, which is a horrible loss for the city. And I wish her well, and I can't say that I blame her, given the pay cut and some of the other factors that have been in this discussion. So, in terms of another thing that was frustrating, the navigation team. I voted along with council members Strauss, Peterson, and Juarez to preserve the navigation team and maybe try to work to reconfigure its mission, but keep it out in the field. We went down on that in a close vote. It was 5-4, but the navigation team was also defunded in the summer budget session. So it remains to be seen what's going to fill that void. I'm going to try to have a town hall on the 19th. Next week, so next Wednesday, in order to talk about some ways that we might be able to go forward without the NAV team. But it is an unfortunate loss, and I wish that my colleagues would have worked with me and others to bake in some kind of replacement before getting rid of the NAV team. Given that, we have we have the worst problem with unsanctioned encampments that we've ever had in the city right now in the COVID era. And I don't think it sends the right message to be getting rid of the NAV team at this time. But in any event, I'm sure we'll talk more about homelessness later, so I'll leave it at that for now. The last thing I would touch on with the police and moving forward to the fall, we can realize massive changes in the police department by moving certain functions to civilian control, which has actually been a big ask of the Decrim Seattle coalition of folks that we've been working with. To put it in perspective, you can do a 10% defund of the police department just by moving 911 dispatch to civilian control. Which is something that has long been sought by the dispatchers themselves, and something that was actually recommended 6 years ago in a report on fine-tuning and expanding our capability to do 911 response. So, there's a lot of balls that are still up in the air on this. We really didn't do all that much in the summer session, but we set up conversations for bargaining and for making bigger and longer lasting reforms in the fall. My hope is to work collaboratively with Chief Diaz, who's going to be in there now, to figure out ways that we can negotiate these transitions and successfully provide additional capacity for the police to respond to the core of their mission, which is to investigate and solve crimes. No one is suggesting that we should send someone else to criminal calls, but for these non-criminal calls that are currently taking up a lot of police time, I think there's a lot of scope to work something out with the department. I've also been talking extensively with Captain Allen, who is our new West Precinct commander, who has been in the position for the past 6 months since Captain Mahaffey assumed his new role as the Assistant Chief for Patrol. Captain Allen and I are having frequent conversations about West Precinct staffing priorities, and I want to make sure that Queen Anne and Magnolia are getting attention as well, given that most of it, as you can imagine, right, like a lot of the West Precinct operations are concentrated in the downtown core. So making sure that all the neighborhoods of the city are receiving attention, and particularly in District 7, is important. So I'm happy to answer follow-up questions on that, but that's the basic overview of kind of where we are right now with the police conversations.
Appreciate that. Yeah, one thing that definitely comes to mind and related to that is there's concerns I know that are out there in regards to, as things transition from our police department to other agencies, how do we make sure those crisis situations don't have any lack of support and there's no change in that support as we wait for that transition to complete?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Like I've been an advocate, in addition to Health One, which we could probably stand up fairly quickly. Uh, I've been a big advocate of a low acuity version of first response from that originated in Eugene has been emulated now in Denver, Portland, Oakland, and a couple of other cities. That in Eugene is called CAHOOTS. It's Crisis Assistance Helping Out in the Streets, is the abbreviation. And they have a pretty good track record for being able to handle these kinds of calls. But, as you kind of queued up, Jason, it's going to take time because, we're going to, to do it right, we're going to want to do a pilot. We're going to want to let that pilot prove proof of concept and then scale it up. So, that's probably, that could take as long as a year and a half. I mean, it could take as, if it strikes lightning in a bottle, it could take like 6 months once it gets rolling. And it's not going to get rolling probably until January at the earliest of next year. So, in the meantime, we need to make sure that we maintain adequate staffing. So when someone calls 911, someone is going to go respond to that call. So, uh, that's something that I certainly remain committed to. I think that we can scale up. I mentioned earlier the Health One program that the Seattle Fire Department does. That's something that we could scale up faster because their pilot has been going for all of 2020 so far, and they've got pretty good results, and they've got a pretty good tempo for kind of what they can respond to without police assistance. And in some cases, these low acuity types of first response are going to need police assistance.
Right.
We're also going to need to keep certain like integrated units. So like we've got this great unit called the Crisis Intervention Team, which is a Seattle Police DESC, Downtown Emergency Service Center partnership. And I went and did a ride along with CIT about 3 weeks ago to kind of see them in action. Actually, we went to Magnolia for part of that day, which was interesting. We're kind of more interbay, like the parking lot of that QFC, sort of an interbay. And that's a team that provides like like response to more intense behavioral mental health calls where like you need a police officer in case things get dangerous.
Right.
And we need to make sure that as we're having this conversation that you keep teams like that, because there's still going to be crimes that are committed by people who have a behavioral mental health condition. And like we're going to still need to send police to deal with that, but we also want to send behavioral mental health professionals with the police as well. And the CIT unit is a really good example of that. And I think that we need to be careful because one of the conversations we're having as a council is separating out civilian functions from sworn functions to try to, kind of have separate responses. And to an extent, like that works really well. There's certain things where, we can just totally, excise the police from that service. But when you have something like CIT, it's important that you keep that in the police department and you keep that well funded and you don't try to separate out those DESC workers from the police. But there are tons and tons of calls that involve behavioral mental health that don't require the police to be present. This all comes down to having a well-trained and well-resourced civilian dispatch. And like I've had a lot of talks with the Dispatchers Guild about exactly how things like this could be done, and like there's a lot of models around the country that are doing this pretty well. So I'm optimistic we can work it out, but those services have to be stood up before we're significantly reducing police staffing. I would not support going beyond the 100 provisos that the council's already done, and I don't think that we're intending to put forward any additional provisos in the fall session for patrol positions. But a lot of those reductions are going to happen anyway because of attrition, because of the hiring freeze, because the city doesn't have any money right now. So there's going to be police staffing reductions that are more just based on the fact that we have we did have a $300 million deficit. We now have a $326 million deficit as of this week. So for this year, and that's just resulting in, if nothing else, through the hiring freeze, we're going to lose patrol officers. But whether it's beyond attritional in 2020 is a conversation we're still having.
Excellent. I appreciate you sharing.
And one follow-up to that, brief follow-up, I guess, would be, but you could clarify, because the news is moving so fast of all these major issues in our lives, and we hear bits and parts as a community, but we're not sitting in all these meetings. So can you clarify the status right now of navigation teams? Are there now none, and there is no outreach unless there's a crime being committed, and then you call 911? Is that accurate? There's no one approaching encampments now?
So there's not no one approaching encampments because the nav team is still, those cuts won't go into effect until November. So, I mean, we're going to have nav team support until then, but it's like, it's a countdown, and then it's going to go away because there won't be any money for it anymore. Like I said earlier, I think that's extremely unfortunate right now. Not necessarily because I have, any love for the nav team, but just because I'm open to someone else doing that outreach, but I'd like to lock in an understanding and a plan on exactly how that's going to work before we just yank that outreach. I think there was a good editorial, I don't know if it was today or yesterday, by Allison Eisinger and a couple of other advocates in the Seattle Times, talking about, homelessness advocates, talking about why the navigation team was problematic and how, if we go back to working with Reach, which is a service provider, we can get better results. And I'm totally open to those conversations. And I know a lot of folks in the business improvement area directors, like the business district directors, they're interested in having those conversations. They do a lot of work with Reach. But Reach is not going to go out and remove an encampment if it becomes problematic. And I think that is currently the question, is like, if an encampment gets to the point where it is, like obstructing a public right of way, or it's a magnet for violent crime, we're going to want to be able to remove that encampment. And I don't exactly know what the plan is to do that right now. I'm going to have I'm going to have a town hall on the 19th. I'm still finalizing who all we're going to bring into that. But the premise of the town hall is basically going to be, okay, nav team's gone. I lost that fight along with Dan, Alex, and Deborah. It's gone. So what are we going to do? And just start that conversation and see where it goes. But I don't have a better answer right now, Pat. That's why I wish we would have gone slower on that as a council. But that's where we are now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna, just for the sake of time, skip to a question that is really near and dear to me. So with the Harbor Patrol, it provides such a wide range of duties, which includes dive, search, and rescue. We saw they were used a lot this past weekend on Lake Washington. It ensures boater safety, and it also helps those that are in distress. So when there's a suicide, someone trying to commit suicide on the Ballard Bridge, Harbor Patrol also will help SFD. So with the cutting of the Harbor Patrol, how is the City Council going to address these safety issues?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And the Harbor Patrol is also really important on the other side of the district in Lake Union. They do a lot of kind of support for the houseboat communities that are on the water too, in Lake Union, which is a very residential lake. So, contrary to a lot of the reports in the press, the City Council did not make any additive cuts to the Harbor Patrol. So the Harbor Patrol has 30 FTEs. They have lost 2 FTEs through attrition that aren't going to be replaced through a hiring freeze. So the City Council recognized that and provisoed 2 Harbor Patrol positions. So those are positions that are already gone from the Harbor Patrol. they're not going to be refilled because there's a hiring freeze at the city and we're not hiring anyone anyway. There were proposals to make deeper cuts to the Harbor Patrol. The city council ultimately did not do that. I mean, Danielle, for a lot of the reasons you just articulated, which are very real and very serious. There is talk of expanding the role of the fire department Harbor Patrol to see if there's more functions that they can take on. But I mean, that has to be done in consultation with, looking at the division of labor between the fire and police harbor patrols and seeing how their missions can be more synchronized. But for the moment, I mean, the council has only provisoed 2 positions in the harbor patrol. And if Chief Diaz decides that he wants to put two of the remaining FTEs from elsewhere in the department into the harbor patrol, he's actually he'll be fully within his power to do that. But I haven't actually heard from the harbor patrol directly if the 2 FTEs out of their 30 that have been provisoed are going to significantly impact their ability to respond to the current demands of their mission. But it's something that I'm working with folks on Lake Union and also our recreational maritime industry is very concerned as well, because they have boating DUI enforcement concerns, which is something that would always stay in the police harbor patrol's mission. Fighters can't enforce crime, anti-criminal enforcement. So I definitely think maintaining a functional harbor patrol is going to be important, and going forward, that's what I'm going to try to do for sure.
Perfect. Thank you.